intelligencesquared.com.
You're going to speak against the motion. Perhaps pick up some of Rory's points.
I'm really the only speaker against the motion. A lot of cross-dressing going on. But I do feel that it's not surprising that the other side is in such chaos, because the very idea of generation is a banal, unsustainable concept. The idea that a biological accident, the fact that you happen to be sharing the same calendar, binds you together into common experience, is inane. I mean, everybody will know that I, as a baby boomer, growing up in one part of the world, have got nothing in common with a Yorkshire miner or a steelworker from Sheffield or somebody growing in Glasgow. The idea that we have something in common, it doesn't make any sense at all. And we know that at the end of the day, of all the social categories that exist, that of generation is the least significant. It's the least significant in telling us anything about that person. But before we get too involved in this blame game about who stole what, I think it's useful to take a reality check. You see, it seems to me that the widely asserted claim that the baby boomers had it unusually good, while today's youth live in an unprecedented life of poverty, is actually an assertion that's based on a fantasy or historical amnesia. I mean, if anybody was around, as I was in the 1960s, you will know that there were some good things, but you will know, as I know, that free love was never always free, and invariably wasn't love. And a lot of the things that we kind of fantasize back retrospectively, wasn't really like it was. And I do remember that the vast majority of the people that I knew in the 1960s never went near university, never had the kind of educational opportunities that we now take for granted, even amongst working-class children. And I do think that the fantasy side of it has got to be really taken up. The other week, I think it was last week, I read a very sweet article in the Evening Standard titled, "Oldies Should Make Room for My Generation." Oldies should make room for my generation. Very sweet, sort of, kick out the old bastards, sort of. I mean, they're taking up these bad blockers and all the rest of them. And what I thought was really interesting from a sociological point of view was that this woman journalist referred to herself as a member of Generation Rent. I am a member of Generation Rent. The idea being, I'm a 26-year-old journalist for the Evening Standard, totally impoverished.
Frank, just keep near your microphone.
Totally impoverished, I got a rent. And the idea of saying that you're renting, the implication of that was that people who lived in the 60s and the 70s all had these mansions, all had these houses. And there's this kind of prejudice that's now acquired the status of an incontrovertible truth, which basically says that people who grew up in the 70s when they were 25, 26, all had these houses. They never rented. Well, actually, I don't know if there's anybody here in this room who was 20-something in the 1970s. How many people do you know that actually owned a house? Because I can tell you, in 1974, I moved into a flat in Kentish Town, shared a house with 6 other people, all of them young professionals, and we even engaged with a phenomenon that the young somethings of today, the rent generation of today, I'm renting generation, never heard about. I was shocked coming from Canada, which was an outside loo. I don't know if you know what an outside loo is. In the middle of the London winter. It's not a pleasant experience. In fact, in those days, not only did you have to use an outside loo, you had to bring your own bog paper, right? Because the situation was so dire that nobody left the whole roll out there because you knew that would be gone by the time you went back there again. Right? And I even remember these big discussions occurring amongst this very kind of prosperous generation about what kind of bog paper to buy, because English bog papers in those days were made of sandpaper. Right? They literally made of sandpaper, and unless you had a lot of money in those terms and went out and bought the one brand that was relatively soft, you were in big trouble. But anyways, this idea that somehow people in the 70s, sort of owned their houses, whereas today we're renting them, is actually the very opposite of reality. As you probably all know, the only decade in which people in their 20s began to buy their own property was for a very, very brief period in the 1990s. It was a 1990s phenomenon which is now historically projected backwards and forwards, totally confusing us about the very simple fact that people today, the generations today, live in circumstances that are unthinkable for the boomer generation. If you come to my university, I've been teaching in my university for 40 years. When I arrived at my university, students' accommodation looked like a minimum security prison cell. I don't know if anyone went to university in those days, but the beds, you needed to be a dwarf to be comfortable in those kinds of beds, right? That was the only thing that would work. Today, at my university in Canterbury, we have 3 levels of accommodation, including 5-star, right? With your ensuite bathroom, right? And all the rest of that. Totally unthinkable in those days. I'm just mentioning these things to you because it seems to me that there's a reality check that we need to take about this kind of stuff. And historical amnesia notwithstanding, I think it's also important to remember that the baby boomers experienced intense periods of economic hardship. Not just simply the poor sections of the baby boomers, not just the poor section of the working class, but I do remember the 1970s and the 3-day week. I do remember mass unemployment in the 1970s, and I do remember the early 80s when many of my friends, all educated in universities, were on the dole queue looking for jobs. So don't think for one second that the baby boomers had this incredibly intensely prosperous experience, which is now the very opposite to the poor children that are growing up now in rented accommodation, sort of in all these kinds of hovels, because that's not really how it works. In fact, I would want to suggest that the real issue here is not a generational one in the way that it's posed. The real issue is the way that we are infantilizing generations. Because one of the problems with this debate about who stole what, who's responsible, of setting generation against generation, is the infantilization of young people. And I think it's interesting that the people that began this discussion weren't young people. It wasn't like young people got up one morning and said, oh, the older generation, they robbed us of all of our money, let's rebel against them. It was actually a lot of old farts who were feeling guilty about something in their life. I don't know what it was, maybe a second marriage or a third marriage or something kind of going wrong. And they decided that the best way to resolve it was by indicating, sort of how sensitive they were to the needs of these poor children. I think it's interesting. Sometimes you read, and it's fantastic. For example, I was reading Anatol Koletsky of the Times the other day. Not exactly a youngster, sort of another elderly person inciting young people to rebel. And he says, old people should give their votes to children. Right? It's bad enough, asking old people to give their bedroom to strangers, right, which is what the Intergenerational Foundation is asking for. You give your democratic vote over to your children. He says, since the elderly will never acknowledge, even to themselves, that they are voting selfishly and against their children's interests, depriving them of their vote is only fair. Well, speak for yourself, Anatol. Maybe that's how you vote. Maybe that's the worldview that you've got. But the fact that so many of these elderly journalists and elderly commentators are inciting young people tells me that something interesting is going on. And let me tell you what this is. Historically, generational conflict and tension is a really good thing. I think young people, unless they rebel, are never truly young. If young people become old before their age and roll over and imitate their parents, you know that something is really wrong. And we know, for example, that ever since the ancient Greece, the younger generations were regarded as the future. Their rebellion was intimated that they were going to change the world into a world that would be better than ever before. And in that tension that grew up in Sparta and Athens, many of the elder generations, many of the older men, were actually, sort of respected the fact that here were these heroic young people rebelling and trying to make their own way. And that was a creative dynamic. There's a lot of tension there. And if you read literature, sons and fathers are a continuous tension that comes up time and time again. There's nothing really wrong with that. It's very, very healthy. It's a very positive way that the history kind of moves on and develops. Unfortunately, there's a difference between young people rebelling because they want to seize the world, they want to alter it in their image, they want to create something new. There's a difference between that and the I'm renting generation argument. Look at me, I'm just renting. Look at me, I got this bedsit that I'm renting in. And what she's really saying is, give me a bedroom, right? Give me a bedroom. Give us a bedroom. Not a very heroic imagination there. She's not really saying anything particularly kind of profound. If you look at the slogans in the so-called generational struggle today, they are, bail us out, give us a handout, take better care of us. It's almost like an infantilized reaction to the generational dynamic. It's not saying, I'm going to take this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to impose myself on that particular situation. It's look after me. I always think, there's this one guy, I was doing some interviews, a 32-year-old young man who actually worked in the city, and he was living at home with his mom and dad. And I asked him, at your age, sort of, why do you do that? Sort of said, well, it's very comfortable. Mom cleans for me. I got my room. I can save my money. I can do as much gaming as I want. 30-year-old guy gaming half the night. And you get that kind of Peter Pan infantilized syndrome where you want to be kind of looked after, which is what the main ideological and cultural impulse is behind this. And it seems to me that what we have got to remember is that actually the fault does lie with the baby boomers, but not because they've stolen so much wealth from future generations, because that dynamic never really exists. The wealth of the future is going to be created in the future. We don't live in a static world where the wealth of today sort of indicates what's going to be there tomorrow. The baby boomers are responsible because of their child-centered obsession, because so many fathers and mothers live through their children. So many mothers and fathers in their 40s are so delighted that their children still lives with them, that parenting for life is now becoming valued and culturally celebrated instead of saying, when are they going to leave already? When are they going to go? And it seems to me that if you have this kind of inciting of young people, infantilizing them, or burdening them with our guilt, in the way that we're doing, what we do end up with is a very sordid generational tension that is really about the small things in life. It actually distracts young people, or could distract young people, from having a vision about the real possibilities that could occur. Because at the end of the day, the conflict between generations doesn't really count for very much. We have a lot of conflicts that do matter. They're about class, they're about ethnic tensions, cultural tensions, lifestyle tensions. Some of those things do matter, but the one that really doesn't matter very much is that between the generations. One final word. What young people need is not a bigger slice of the cake. They don't need to get a better home by taking my home away. They don't need to have a better suit by taking my jacket away. Or they don't need to have greater political power by taking the vote away of an older person. We don't need to redistribute this fixed cake. What we need to have is the baking of a larger cake, a much, much larger cake by young people. And any young generation worthy of its name will do its best to make sure that what it will create in the future will be much more productive, much more efficient, much more resourceful than what we have now.
Frank, you have to stay there. Thank you very much, Frank. That was fantastic. I'm going to ask David to put the first question to you.
Of course, the fantastic motor of modern, advanced technology and industry will carry on turning. Of course, the growth, we expect economies to grow, and in Frank's words, the cake to get bigger. That isn't the question. The question is whether at any moment in time, when you look at the position of different generations, how they're being treated. And in fact, my view would be precisely because of this confidence that the growth has got bigger, that growth will ensure the cake gets bigger, is one of the arguments that we have used to break the contract between the generations. The Victorians, when they built this Royal Geographic Society, they didn't say, well, in 150 years' time, they're going to be so much richer than us, we might as well build it in the cheapest materials, just do it in papier-mâché. In 50 years' time, they'll be richer, they can rebuild it. We have enjoyed endowments left for us by generations that were poorer than we are, and we have an obligation to generations that will indeed be richer than we are.
Thank you. Laurie, is there a question you'd like to put?
Yes. I'm not sure if Mr. Furedi's ever met any young people, but do you really think that the people outside protesting in London, for example, really just want to be looked after? I mean, they've got an enormous banner up saying capitalism is crisis. I mean, there is something bigger going on here than just asking to be looked after. You seem to have based your entire talk off one article. I mean, I agree with you here, I made that clear, but it seems massively patronising just to suggest that all young people are asking for, and all people, you know, it's not just young people out there are asking for, is to be looked after. There is a much bigger demand going on for a society that, you know, that looks after all of its members and in which resources are distributed fairly. This is not just about asking for a handout here. Do you really think that's what it's about?
Yeah, I do. And I'm really glad you used the example of the protests. Mm-hmm. Because, you see, I grew up in an era where protest was about getting something, taking something away. And people who protested had a very short time frame. They basically said, we're going to go out on the streets, we're going to fight, and we're going to try to get this now. Maybe tomorrow, but as soon as possible. What you got at St. Paul's Cathedral or at Wall Street are a lot of time-rich people who've got a lot of time on their hands.
They don't have any jobs.
Well, that's debatable. If you actually look at the analysis of people, and I might not know young people in clubs, but I do mix with people, and I have gone to some of these occupations. They're not exactly the poorest section of society, as it happens. Many of them have jobs, and there's nothing wrong with protesting and having jobs, but their time scale is a very luxurious one, because what they're saying is that the way we determine our success is by how long we stay in these tents. Right? The longer we're there, the more effective the protest. Now that, to me, is infantilized protest. I mean, that's the way children protest. That's not the way that serious young people who have a sense of urgency and want to change the world go about protesting. And I'm sorry, I think the protest demonstrations, to me, I'm just very sad that in the 21st century, young people, you know, sort of have lost sight of the relationship between the present and the future.
Hang on, Frank.
And live in the long present.
Why should that be an example if they're not being serious? I mean, they're not going to solve the problems of capitalism in a week.
Well, it seems to me that if you're, you know, if you're saying that sitting in a tent, you know, having meetings, having discussions, smoking dope, drinking a bit of beer, you know, sort of is a means to achieving something, then maybe I'm a little bit thick. Maybe I've lost the plot. It seems to me that what's being done here is a kind of a ritual, you know, sort of almost like a 21st century mendicant, you know, sort of look at us, you know, we're here, that's brilliant. That means you're lowering your sight. You're saying that, you know, our objective is more or less already been achieved because we haven't even moved on. That, to me, it represents an all-time low in history as far as what the objectives of protest is.
Okay, although having been down there to the occupation, I'd say the fact that they're sitting there having discussions not only with one another but with so many passers-by, including men in pinstripe suits, is actually what democracy is all about. They're actually having discussions and changing people's minds. Ed just wanted to put a question to that. Oh, I'm just observing and keep things going.
Okay, well, this is where I pull a penny, but not literally, and switch sides, because I've got some problems. You know, the idea that people, you know, sit in tents, smoking dope, sitting, you know, having lots of free love and possibly paying for it, and, you know, drinking lots of beer. This is what happened in the 1960s. It's not what happened at the student protest. It's not what happened in March when there was occupying Fortnum Masons, although that was a little peculiar. They sort of sat around the atrium, and Laurie can tell you more about it. It's very strange. But there's a problem with my learned and genuinely brilliant you know, colleague's argument, which is just this, very quickly. You can't say to us suddenly that young people are infantilized and that's the problem, and then when they say, well, we need jobs and houses in order that we can live independent lives, dismiss their concerns. One. And two, you can't say that they refuse to impose themselves on situations and then complain that when they do protest, it's ridiculous. Sorry.
Well, Frank, do you want to make a last rejoinder in 30 seconds?
Yeah, it's only because I got a baby boomer idea what a protest is. And that idea is that you get involved in action, you organize people to achieve a specific objective. You've either achieved it or you didn't achieve it. Right? That's what protest is. Protest isn't, sort of sitting around and talking to each other rather than to the rest of the world. It's the very opposite, because protest usually means convincing the rest of the world about your case, transforming ideas rather than convincing each other in an isolated kind of setting. And it seems to me that if you want to call this protest, fine, but we just redefined it to mean, sort of staying quiet, staying passive, staying infantilized.